Good morning. Okay, I'm gonna situate my camera real quick. All right. Oh, shoot. Okay, let me turn. Okay, awesome. All right. Welcome to Quarantine Kitchen, episode 7. Got a couple people watching us already. Good morning. Good morning. How's everyone doing? Drop us a little comment in the chat box to let us know how you're feeling this morning and if you're excited for some new ideas about summer squash. All right, my oven is yelling at me over here. So let me grab my food here. All right, let's see here. So I talked about summer squash today, and I went ahead and got a head start so everything would be ready on time. So this is my roasted squash. I'm going to go over it how I prepared it in just a minute. This is the first half of the cooking time, and I'm just flipping it over to make sure that it gets the opportunity to get browned on both sides. We've got some good browning on a few of these pieces. There we go. Okay, oven timer, I'm coming. There we go. Go. One more. All right, so those are all flipped and ready to go back into the oven for a few more minutes. Got it. Okay, got it. All right, so like I said, I went ahead and got a couple of things started so we don't take too much of your time today, but thank you for joining us. As we all know here in the South, squash and zucchini are a homegrown staple. You're gonna find them super cheap at all of the grocery stores and probably in a lot of people's backyard gardens right now. So I wanted to give you a few new ideas on how you can use summer squash in your cooking, because as a Southern staple, our typical cooking methods are going to be really high in saturated fat. So does anyone have any ways that they like to cook squash that they would like to share? If you don't, I already have a few right off the top of my head. Anybody? Okay, let me make sure I can see my chat box. Okay, so first thing that comes to mind when I think of squash is fried. Fried squash, cut into rounds, battered and fried, and that is delicious. But it's not something we should have all of the time. Another way that is really in the South is like a squash casserole, and that's typically going to have some butter added. Some people like to add mayo to their mixture, and sometimes like some full fat milk. So we're just adding fat on top of this super low calorie and low carb vegetable. So it's really high in water content, similar to that of cucumbers. So we're looking at like 95% water. So when you cook your squash, you want to try not to overcook it. So I say that after introducing some of the typical Southern ways to cook it, which is usually very, very soft. So for my preference, I like for it to have a little bit of bite left once it's been cooked. So I'm going to show you a couple of ways to do that. So first off, over here in my skillet, we'll see if I can do this. This is my cheesy skillet squash recipe. It's very simple and can be easily converted into a whole meal dish. The way that I'm making it today is a side dish. So what I did was I started off by sauteing some onion and some olive oil. And once it started to get clear just a little bit, I added a few cloves of chopped garlic. So you can use garlic powder here in this step. It's totally up to you. I had some fresh on hand, and I personally love fresh, so I chose to add some fresh chopped garlic to it. And then once the onions were cooked a little clear, not too long, less than 5 minutes, I went ahead and added some tomato sauce. So you could use a jarred spaghetti sauce that you might have some left over already, or you could use a can of tomato sauce, or you could use diced tomatoes or crushed tomatoes. You can use any variety of tomato. So if you are not using a jar of tomato sauce, like for spaghetti, you're going to want to add some extra seasonings to this. So I added some Italian seasoning, and then the garlic cloves is my extra seasoning. So if you're using plain tomato sauce, make sure you zhuzh it up a little and make it taste Italian-y. You can add some oregano or basil or thyme, or any of those. All of those are dried components of Italian seasoning. So I like to just buy one, and then it includes all of them. Especially when it's in the store brand variety, and it's usually a lot cheaper than some of her name brand varieties. So our squash and our zucchini are just cooking down over here, not too long. We don't want them to be mushy, but I'm going to give it a stir, and then I'm going to show you a couple of ways that you can cut your squash. This is looking good over here. So one thing that I'm looking for on this cheesy skillet squash recipe is that I want my squash to release some water, and then I want that water to cook down a little bit. So like I mentioned, squash is really high in water content. So they're going to add water to whatever you are cooking them in. So for this, I'm just trying to cook it down. So I'm gonna let this cook a little bit more. My oven just beeped again for my roasted squash, so I'm gonna go check on that real quick. Oh, that's beautiful. Here is the completed product of the roasted squash. This is going a lot faster than I had planned, so I'm getting ahead of myself, but that's okay. So all I did with this roasted squash was I made sure that the pieces are cut in at least at 1/2 inch slices, so your squash doesn't turn to mush once it is cooked. Because there's nothing worse, I mean, in my opinion, I'm going to say in my opinion, than just really mushy squash. In a lot of Southern dishes, that's how they always end up, is they're just a little bit overcooked for my preference. Also, for nutrition purposes, I'll talk about that in a minute. So for this, all I did was I laid them flat out on the pan. You can see that they're separated, they're not touching each other. And that's really important because if you are crowding the pan, they're going to steam more than roast. So that's really important, because if they are too close to each other, they're releasing their water, and they're going to sit in their water. So whenever they're separated, that water can evaporate off as it's cooking, and then they have more opportunity to become brown. So I did about 15 minutes on one side, and then I flipped them over for about 5 more minutes because I noticed that they are getting soft. Yeah. So one other important thing I want to share about the roasted squash and zucchini is that it works best if it is cut into rounds. So that means that the inside of the squash is not exposed, if you will. So when you've got the skin around it on the outside, it contains the center softest part. So if it does get mushy, it doesn't completely fall apart. Like, you still have solid pieces to work with. So keep your squash in nice slices, and then you can cut them however you want to. They're easy to eat just like this. Cool. So this is our squash. I use cooking spray instead of a liquid oil to decrease how much fat I was going to use and make sure that they weren't too wet with the cooking fat that I use. So I just lay them out flat, and then I just a little layer of cooking spray. I sprinkle the Italian seasoning, a little bit of salt and pepper, flip them over, cooking spray, salt, pepper, Italian seasoning, and then into the oven they went. So delicious. I would personally eat this on top of another salad once they cooled off. That would be delicious, or it'd be a good side dish to some grilled meats or whatever you prefer. You could put this inside of a quesadilla. That would be delicious. So just some thoughts there. This is a great way to cook your squash and use less fat and still get a lot of flavor. Okay, so that one is done. I'm gonna move this over to the side, and I'm gonna turn my oven timer off. All right. So I've given my squash over here to my right a little stir, and it's starting to cook down a little. It's not soft as I want it to be just yet. So I'm going to go ahead and put a lid on it and make sure that it is steaming while cooking. There we go. Back to my whole squash here. So there are several ways that you can cut your squash, and it's not super difficult to cut. I just wanted to show you a couple of ways, especially how I cut it for the salad I'm going to show you next, as well as this dish, and then rounds are straightforward. So whenever you are at the grocery store and you're going to pick up some squash, you want to make sure that it is firm all the way around and there aren't any mushy spots. So sometimes you can find squash on clearance, and there might be a clearance produce section at your grocery store, or they've just dropped the price down because it's the end of the day and they're trying to get rid of it. It is okay if there's like one spot that's a little soft. You can always cut that out, and the rest of your squash will be just fine. So this one has some little bumps around all of it because squash has very thin skin. So it's similar to, say, an apple or a pear that is really ripe. If you bump it, you can indent the skin and open it up to potential outside germs. So for this one is good. It's just got some bumps. There's nothing that's open to the outside. So I'm happy with it. What I did was to wash it off. You want to make sure that you scrub it well enough because they can just hang on to dirt, especially if you are growing it in your backyard or getting it from someone local or a local farmer's market. Make sure you give it a really good scrub. So this yellow squash it's a yellow squash, obviously, but it's a straight neck instead of a crook neck variety. So my store that I went to didn't have any crook neck varieties. It also didn't have any whole zucchinis. I think that was really popular recently, and the zucchini section was completely empty because they're in season and they're cheap. So note to self, keep that in mind when you go to look for these. They might be out at the grocery store. So I was able to find some already pre-cut in that section of the produce aisle, but you're going to keep in mind that if you're buying it pre-cut, it's going to cost you more money. But I needed it, so I bought it because it was necessary for this. So just keep that in mind. Buying things whole and cutting it yourself, taking a few extra minutes to cut it yourself will save you a lot of money. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut off my ends. So I'm just going to take my knife and cut off the end here. And this guy, we don't need these. So for my saute here, what I did was I cut it into rounds. With the saute dish, you don't have to pay super close attention to the size, the thickness of your rounds, as long as they're all similar in size, because when they're similar in size, they're going to cook at a similar amount of time. So if you've got some really big pieces and some really small pieces, your dish might be cooked uneven, and you could have some that cooks very fast and some that is still not finished, while other parts are overdone. So you want to make sure they're all similar size. So these are all pretty similar in thickness here. So all I did was I cut some rounds, and then I took my knife and then I just cut them into quarters. So I cut the whole stack in half, and then I turn it and I cut it again in half. So that just saves you some time. You don't have to cut each individual piece in half or into quarters individually. So this is how I cut it for the saute. So for my salad, I decided I wanted it to look a little bit different. So I did the same thing by starting with some rounds. Same thing, as long as your rounds are similar size, the thickness doesn't matter too much. So what I did here, same situation, cut it into rounds and then stack them on top of each other. But instead of cutting it into quarters, I cut it into matchsticks going straight across. So it's just a different texture for the salad and a different size. So if you got a couple of these bites in your mouth, that might be a little bit big. But if you were to cut it this way, you'll be able to, it'll feel more comfortable to eat. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut this guy into little slices like this. There. So then your final product looks like this instead of like this. So that's totally up to you if you wanted to use this method for your salad, and you could use these to eat raw with things like hummus or ranch dip or something like that, because squash is a very mild flavor. And it's going to take on whatever flavor you mix it with. So that's always really good for fun dips and stuff like that. So this is my salad size. All right, one more thing I wanted to show you is you can also cut your squash into what kind of looks like French fries. And you can make squash fries similar to how you would make zucchini fries or sweet potato fries. And you would cook that the same way that you cooked your roasted squash that I talked about just a minute ago. Just need my oven mitt here. But this is cooking down nicely. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, that looks really good. So they have softened up and they still have some texture. So I'm going to give it just another minute with the lid on. Looks beautiful. Lid back on. Okay, so to make fries with your squash, you'll decide how long you want them to be. I think this is a little too long. I mean, for like a stereotypical French fry, that could be fine, but I want to make it a little bit shorter. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut it in half so I can have my little sticks. So what you're going to do is you're going to cut this piece in half long ways. Okay, and then you're going to cut it into thirds long ways. You could cut it into quarters if you want to. That'll be a pretty thick French fry size if that's what you're looking for. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it a little bit to the edge. That way I can cut it without cutting straight down the middle. So these are my fry shapes, if you will. This one got a little thin, so it's going to get really soft when you cook it. But nobody's going to cut these things perfectly. So I've got these two, which are really good sizes, and you can treat those like fries. I don't think that I mentioned the cooking temperature for roasting the squash. I've got mine at 425. A pretty high temperature because we want to make sure it doesn't cook faster than it can brown. You could bump it up a little bit higher if you want to, because my roasted squash is a little bit softer than I like for it to be. So I think I would maybe bump it up to 500 if your oven goes that high. I know they don't always. Or you could put it under the broiler to get a really nice brown right there at the end without leaving it in there too long waiting for it to brown. So you've got some options there. Okay, so I'm going to go on and finish up this, cheesy skillet squash I've got over here, and then I'm going to go over to our salad, which is this most simple salad. Okay, let me move this. Okay, so this looks delicious and it smells delicious. So I mentioned a few minutes ago that this is considered a side dish in the way that I prepared it right now. So we've just got vegetables here in this dish. So if you wanted to make this a meal, you could make it a vegetarian meal by adding, a can of beans that you have drained and rinsed, and that'll add you some really good protein and really good fiber to help keep you full. My preference, I love pinto beans. That is my #1 bean preference all the time. So I use them for anything, even if it's non-traditional. So a traditional bean for this might be like a white kidney bean or a cannellini bean. That's the same thing. For me, I would put pinto beans because they're delicious and I like them the most. You can add kidney beans. It doesn't matter what color your beans are. You could use black beans or you could use chickpeas. It's totally up to you. That would make a really heartier dish. You can serve this over some whole grain pasta or some brown rice or with whole grain toast if that's the carbohydrate that you have available at the time. You can do that in any of those capacities to make it more of a well-rounded meal. So you've got some ideas there. You can also, for a non-vegetarian version, you can use any kind of ground meat that you like. You could start the ground beef in the pan with the onions on the first step. And then you might want to drain off any fat that accumulates if you've got a higher fat meat. And then you'll continue with the dish. Add your zucchini and squash, add your and your seasonings, and then let it simmer down until you've got a really nice thick consistency. You can see that it's really nice and thick. Okay, so last but not least, it's called cheesy skillet squash for a reason because it's got to have some cheese on top. So I'm just going to spread this out evenly. Okay, I'm going to turn my stove top down to low, and then I'm just going to sprinkle some cheese on top. And I'm gonna put the lid on it and I'm gonna let the cheese melt, and then it's done and it's ready to eat. Not a ton of cheese, just enough to cover the top. We're not looking for a super thick layer because we're looking for a lower fat option for our squash. So I'm going to cover this and give it a minute to melt because it's going to build up some heat a little bit, even though I turned down the stovetop. Okay, so recipe is going to be a really quick salad that actually reminds me of my dad and how he used to eat cucumbers when I was a kid. So I've got my matchstick squash and zucchini already cut up. I'm gonna mix those together. And then I have about 1/4 of an onion. I honestly couldn't tolerate any more of how strong this onion was. I don't know why it was so strong today, but I was in tears, which doesn't always happen to me. So I have about 1/4 of an onion. I didn't want to be overpowering for the dish, but I wanted to give another flavor instead of just the squash. And so last, I made a little simple vinaigrette with olive oil and apple cider vinegar. So I use a 3:2 ratio for mine. So that means 3 parts oil to 2 parts vinegar. And that is because I like things to be sour. I have a really sour tooth. That's not a thing. But I personally like it to be sour. So if you don't like very acidic foods, or it doesn't work really well for you in your digestive system, or you tend to get heartburn, you can start with a 3-1. So 3 parts olive oil, 1 part acid or vinegar. And then you can taste it and decide if you can tolerate more acid, or if you need more of that flavor. So that is totally up to you. So this is my 3-2 olive oil apple cider vinegar. I'm going to give it just a little sprinkle of salt in my salad dressing, not a lot. And then I'm going to give it some Italian seasoning. Maybe you guys are noticing a theme today. There's a lot of Italian seasoning in all of these recipes today. For one, it's very convenient to have several herbs and spices in one container. And it also goes really well with squash. Like I said, squash is going to take on the flavor of whatever you cook it with. So we want to make sure our sauce is flavorful and our salad dressing is flavorful. This is my fun little way to mix things when you have a little bowl and that's not big enough. It's like a hand mixer. Actually, it's a manual hand mixer, not an electric hand mixer. There we go. It also helps to emulsify the salad dressing together. So it's going to generally separate the oil and the vinegar. So that makes, you're gonna see that it looks a little bit creamier than it did at the beginning, and that's because it has emulsified together. So if you left it alone though, it's going to separate back out. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay, so we got our veggies in the bowl. All I'm gonna do is top it off with my salad dressing. So you could also use a store-bought salad dressing, like an Italian salad dressing. That would be really delicious with this salad. And you can make those decisions like based on your preference. So very simple, basic salad with a basic salad dressing. You can add other veggies. I think some really small broccoli crowns would be delicious. You could also add, you can add anything to this. You could add some beets to this. It's going to make everything pink, but you can add some beets, or let's see, you could probably add some cucumbers too, but that's very similar to the zucchini. So we want to add something that's a little bit different. See, I like the shape of this. Everything is a similar shape. So the onions are similar to the cut of everything else. So I really like that. So that is my very simple salad recipe. Let's check on our cheese over here. It has melted beautifully. So at this point, if you took one step back and you added your cheese to your dish, you could technically put the whole pan in the oven under a broiler to get your cheese brown. So I will clarify that your pan has to be oven safe. It's going to be a completely metal pan. It can't have any plastic components or hand guards that can melt in the oven. So your pan will tell you on the bottom if it is oven safe. If you wanted to do that, you could do that. But for the sake of this and the way the recipe is written is, you can see that it is all nice and melted now, and it is ready to be eaten. Let's see, I'm going to dish out a little bit. Oh my goodness, that's cheesy. See, that's what I was talking about. That's the cheesy part. There we go. So you can mix in your ground beef preference, ground meat preference, or you can add some beans to this, throw it over some pasta or some rice, and you've got a full, complete meal. Okay, awesome. Well, that went a little quicker. Actually, that went pretty well on timing today, actually. I need to try to have things prepared a little bit earlier from now on. I think that It's going to save you guys some time. I am looking to see if I have any questions, but I don't see any in my chat box at the moment. And that could just be based on my current view. So I'm going to take 1 second and figure out if I have some questions. Okay. Okay, I do have some comments. Here we go. Good morning. Hello. Stewed squash is your favorite. Okay, let's see. Hello from Oxford, Georgia. Hello. Roasting is your favorite too, Faye. Roasting is my favorite. I love roasting vegetables. You can put it in there and you can start working on other components of your meal and not have to like babysit it as if you were sitting on the stove. So I really like that. I love roasting squash. I love that, Lan. Let's see. Stewed squash. Stewed squash. I always feel like on the fence about stewed squash. And I think I just had a bad experience when I was a kid because I just didn't like how soft it was. So that's my preference. I love it. You love it. Okay, cool. Yumski. Hi, Althea. Cool. Do we have any questions from anybody about squash? All of this information was pretty basic today. I just want you to keep in mind that your squash is going to cook really fast. So if you want to keep some texture, you're going to want to cook it at a high temperature for a shorter amount of time. And it's always going to release some water when you cook it. So keep that in mind based on what you want to add it to once you're cooking it. You may have to cook down some of the water content. So I've got several other options for using your squash in our resource folder. I'm going to make sure that I add that to our caption for the video today to link to our resource folder. It is a bit.ly code, so I'll type that out for you. You're going to find a soup recipe framework, one for stir fry, one for a pasta dinner. All of those you can add squash to. So this recipe, the cheesy squash, could technically be considered a pasta dinner if you put it on top of pasta and add a protein. So you can also add it to stir fry. So I've mentioned several times that it cooks really fast. So when you're cooking anything that has different textures of vegetables, you want to start with the hardest vegetable that's going to take the longest to cook first, and then you will add your softer vegetables later. So if you're making a stir fry, you're going to start with like your broccoli and your carrots at the beginning because they take longer to get soft, and then you're going to add your squash in closer to the end. You want everything else to almost be done before you add in your squash. Same thing goes for if you're going to add it to a soup. Don't add it at the beginning because it will completely disintegrate in the soup. So make sure you add it like in the last 10 minutes of cooking. That'll still give you a decent texture to your squash. Let's see, what else did I add in there? I've got a curry recipe. The squash will be delicious in our creamy coconut curry recipe. That has split peas in it as your protein, and it thickens up the whole dish really well. And there is something else in there that I wanted to reference. Here, I'm just going to look real quick. I've got it right in front of me. Okay, curry, cheesy squash. Yep. Cool. Oh, I also wanted to point out our squash produce card. So I have worked with our graphic designer here at the food bank to create step-by-step guides on how to use produce. So a lot of these tips that I've mentioned today, you'll find in that squash produce card, and that's going to work for zucchini or any other type of summer squash. You can find patty pan is a type of summer squash, and it looks like a little flat UFO almost with like a scalloped edges. You can find some that are half green and half yellow, and it's just a combo of a squash and a zucchini. Those are really cool. There are also ones that there is called an 8-ball squash, where it looks like a little mini green pumpkin. It's like a round zucchini, and you can actually stuff those. I've actually never seen one of those at a general grocery store before, but it's cool to think about the different types that are available. Cool, cool, cool. Okay, let's see. Do we have any new recipes? Can you save a soggy squash? Okay, so soggy can mean that it's bad. Or do you mean, okay, so Ariana, so do you mean it is cooked and soggy or it is raw and soggy? Because if it's raw and soggy, I would toss that because I think that was bad. But if it's cooked and soggy, I don't think you can really do anything to make it not be soggy anymore. If I did something like that, I wouldn't, for me, so my preference is not soft squash. So what I would do is I would take that super soft squash and I would add it to something where it mixes in and you don't know that it's there. And that would be really helpful to not toss it. Okay, I see Ariana, like during cooking. Okay, so if it gets too soft, I would add some other things to it to give it texture. So like for this dish, if I overcooked the squash in my cheesy skillet recipe, you can add something that's going to give it texture. So your whole recipe isn't the same texture. So like you could add some broccoli to that and you'll have some crunch and some soft. And that would like balance it out, but your squash, there's no way to take away the sogginess. Unless you add more texture. You could put like some pumpkin seeds on top and make it crunchy, and that will help. That's a really good question. If you eat it over pasta, you're gonna have this different texture from the pasta. So just think about how you can add more texture if it cooks too far down. That's a great question, Ariana. Thank you for that. I hope I answered it well for you. Cool. All right, well, I don't want to take any more of your time, so I really appreciate you all for tuning in today. I hope you learned something new about summer squash. Be sure to check back with me in like 2 minutes. I'm going to get that caption with our resource folder linked so you can see all of the recipes that I talked about today, as well as our produce card and our recipe guides that I mentioned. So thanks again for tuning in. I hope you all are doing well and being healthy, and we will see you again in 2 weeks on September the 1st, which is Hunger Action Month, which was always really exciting around here at the Food Bank. All right, friends, talk to you later.